everyone, my name's Sean, and welcome to another episode of I Don't Like Filming in Yellow Rooms. I have a couple thoughts on Leviticus 26 today. Leviticus isn't really a book we read a lot. I can say I haven't read Leviticus as closely as maybe I've read Matthew or something like that, but it's really a valuable book, and I want to go through and study all the sacrifices and things like that. But as I was reading through it, the second to last chapter, chapter 26. Do not make idols for yourselves, set up a carved image or sacred pillar for yourselves, or place a sculpted stone in your land to bow down to it. For I am the Lord your God. Keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So we have in the first couple of verses of Leviticus 26, God kind of summarizing the purpose, the principles of all the laws that he gave them. And then after this, he gives them the covenant. And I really, really like the way he's laid out this covenant here. So in verses 3 to 13, you have God's blessing. And in verses 14 to 39, you have God's wrath. And through all these verses, it's broken up into sort of 6 chunks or 6 sections. And each of these sections is broken up by the Israelites doing something. So you can see as an example in chapter 26, verse 3, if you follow my statutes and faithfully observe my commands. So you can see that's something that the Israelites can do. And then after each of these verses, the main sort of bulk of all of these verses is things that God does, things that God will do. So you can see right after, in verse 4, I will give you rain at the right time, and the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. And you can see that all throughout the rest of the chapter and the rest of this chunk. I'd highly recommend reading through this. It's really a wonderful passage. So that first section, it keeps talking about God right up until verse 14, and then it sort of changes its tone and there's a new paragraph. So that theme of God doing things continues all through that section, and then there's a new paragraph and it kind of changes its tone. And it's marked by, again, the Israelites doing something. But if you do not obey me and observe all these commands, if you reject my statutes and despise my ordinances, and do not observe all my commands and break my covenant. And my watch just beeped. So here you see the Israelites rejecting God's command, right? And then God goes from verses 16 to 17 about all the things he'll do to them. And this pattern continues. Verse 18, but if after these things you will not obey me, I will proceed to discipline you 7 times for your sins. And he goes on through verses 19 and 20. Verse 21, if you act with hostility toward me. Verse 23, if in spite of these things you do not accept my discipline, but act with hostility toward me. Verse 27, and if in spite of this you do not obey me but act with hostility toward me. So you see here the Israelites doing things over and over again. So first it was if they follow the covenant, then God will bless them. He will do all these things to you. And then 5 times God sort of escalates his wrath to, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, maximum wrath. I mean, it's not really maximum wrath, but it's them breaking the covenant and God disciplining them for doing that. And one of the amazing things I found in this passage is how this is divided up, because it shows the character of God. It shows how God is a loving God and a patient God, right? I've been thinking about how to best say this, but there's sort of one escalation of God's blessing, right? If they keep the covenant, God will give them maximum blessing. And that's really all there is to it, right? But if they break the covenant, then there's 5 sort of steps or 5 escalations of what God will do and how he will discipline them and how he will execute his wrath on them for breaking the covenant. And here's the amazing love and mercy of God just displayed in these verses, you know. God is such a God of love, and he's so patient that he would wait. Well, he doesn't wait, right? He does discipline them at every level, but it gets increasingly worse and worse and worse. He didn't give them one chance and then just exile them, right? He waited and he was patient and he pleaded with them and he sent them prophets, you know. God is a God of love and patience, and he cares so much about the Israelites. The second characteristic of God that I saw in these verses is just the power of God. It sort of blew me away that this is God's covenant, right? This isn't man's covenant that man wrote up or manufactured or that man presented to God. This is something instituted by the Lord, not by anyone else. The Israelites and us the same, we're subject to God's covenant, right? God's not subject to our covenant or our definition of good or evil or anything like this. It's us subject to him and him alone. And you can see in these verses that God has absolute authority, right? He's like, these things will happen. It's not maybe, it's not a possibly. It's God extending his grace, God giving them this covenant, and this covenant is the only way they'll ever be able to enter into the blessing that God's provided for them, or the way they'll enter into the wrath. And you can see just how powerful the Lord is. There's a verse in Isaiah that says, the nations are like a drop in a bucket to the Lord. And you imagine just like a bucket, just like filled with water. And you think of like Russia or the United States or China or Korea or something like that. And it's just like a little wink, just a tiny drop in the bucket. And how powerful God is, and how sovereign he is, and how in control he is of all things. And you can see how bad it really is going to get for the Israelites. I'll just read from verse 27 and a little bit on. So it's the fifth escalation of God's wrath, and it's the Israelites denying the covenant, basically. And if in spite of this you do not obey me, but act with hostility towards me, I will act with furious hostility towards you. I will also discipline you 7 times for your sins. And like, get this is disturbing stuff. You will eat the flesh of your sons, you will eat the flesh of your daughters, you will destroy your high places, cut down your shrines, and heap your lifeless bodies on the lifeless bodies of your idols. I will reject you. That's terrifying. And you think of the Israelites, not a small nation, right? And sensible people, and the amazing things that they built, and the society that they created and stuff. For God to say to them that they'd be eating the flesh of their sons and daughters is a really low point for humanity to get to. And this is the power of God. He can bring people so low that it's unimaginable. I'm sure, like, I can't imagine our society or people or anything or myself ever getting to the point where it was that bad. But here's God basically saying, like, I have the power to do this. And if you don't obey my covenant, these are the kinds of people you will be. And I love that verse. I'll heap the lifeless bodies upon the lifeless bodies of your idols. That is a terrifying picture of the consequences of idolatry and not seeking the Lord. So after all this, there's one more characteristic of God that I want to go over. And I guess it's kind of the first one. It ties into the first one. It's mercy. Because after that fifth escalation, that's the longest escalation, it's the longest chunk talking about God's wrath, it goes into verse 40. So in verse 40 of chapter 26, but when they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, their unfaithfulness that they practiced against me, and how they acted with hostility toward me, and it just kind of keeps going, a long couple verses on confession. And then verse 42, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob. I will also remember my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. And despite Israel's rejection of the Lord, despite every rebellious, evil thing that they did, despite their inexcusable idolatry and just flat out rejection of God, God is going to give them mercy if they confess to him, if they come to him and say, oh man, we were wrong, we're just people and you are God. And that is the same message that's extended to us today. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And if you'll humble yourself before the Lord Almighty today and say that you need him, that you're just people, that you're not the big shot here, you're not calling the shots, you're not making the rules, it's God, and we are subject to God. And God is looking for humility in his people. That's what he's really looking for. And if you'll humble yourself, God will save you. That's what he promises. Everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. I hope this thought was encouraging to you. I really enjoyed chapter 26, and it was kind of a break from all the laws and statutes that God was putting into place. But yeah, I hope this was encouraging to you, and that it fixes your eyes on the Lord Almighty and the immense power he has, but also the immense love he has for us and his grace and mercy. Thanks for watching. Like if this was encouraging to you, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. There's no funny outtakes for this one. It was pretty smooth, actually. There's going to be less and less funny outtakes as I get better at doing these, so I don't know what I'm going to put in this end part. later or after.